Hi, Ken Fader, your friendly neighborhood archaeologist, talking some more about archaeological frauds, myths, and mysteries. And today, we're going to talk about a very important archaeological fraud. This one had staying power. This one convinced a lot of scientists that it was legit. They should have known better. But it's the fascinating tale of the Piltdown Man hoax. Among the things that could only happen to me, I was in England in 2007. Looking at archaeological sites, saw Stonehenge and affiliated sites. It was great. And spent some time in London. And in London, I went to the British Museum, which is a spectacular museum. If you live in New York, American Museum of Natural History. If you live in Chicago, the Field Museum. There are large, beautiful natural history museums, some that are more than 100 years old, that are all over the country. And in England, the British Museum and its affiliated museums, including the Natural History Museum, are part of that same tradition. So I was there, and as long as I was in the British Museum, I thought, wow, you know what? I know that people who worked at the Natural History Museum, again, which at the time was a subunit of the British Museum, were involved with Piltdown. Not involved in carrying it out, but certainly were among the people who were most important in furthering that hoax to the world of scientists. So I figured for sure they're going to have an exhibit at the British Museum. So go through the museum, and there is a nice exhibit of human evolution, and they have some fossil casts and talks about that. But I didn't see anything about Piltdown, which is, again, the most important and significant archaeological, paleontological hoax. So I was surprised by that. So I went back and looked in the area around where the human evolution section was. Again, couldn't find it. So I went to the front desk and I asked there was a young woman, probably a student volunteer, if she could help me. Now I gotta be honest with you. To me, people who speak English in England just sound smart. I just love the accent. And to me, I think when they hear me talk, what they're hearing is not my voice, but I don't know, Jethro from the Beverly Hillbillies. So I'm saying, hello there, and they're thinking I'm saying, golly, just my own insecurity. So this woman had a beautiful British accent, and so I asked her, yeah, I wonder, where is the exhibit on Piltdown? Is there an exhibit about Piltdown in this museum? Now, she was young, probably a student, didn't register. She goes, oh, sir, I don't know. Let me talk to my supervisor. And she walks away, and then from behind the curtain comes a woman with even a more beautiful British accent. And she's wearing glasses, readers. And she comes over, she says, sir, may I help you? And I said, oh yeah, I'm really interested in the Piltdown, and I'm wondering if there's an exhibit of the Piltdown Man. And it was just a thing of beauty. She looked at me, she kind of cocked her head. She looked over her readers and said, oh, sir, there's no exhibit of that here. It was all rubbish, And I just kind of, okay, I'm sorry. I even asked, well, yeah, I know it's rubbish. I've written a chapter in a book about it. But I didn't say that. I just said, oh, okay. To their credit, the British Museum, their separate entity now, it became separate in 1963. The separate entity, the Natural History Museum, has a wonderful website all about Piltdown, and maybe at the last screen on this PowerPoint we can add that link. So no, I didn't see anything about Piltdown there, but it's a fascinating story. This is, in fact, the wonderful British Museum, and great stuff there, by the way. This is the Rosetta Stone. You've probably heard of the Rosetta Stone, and a lot of Egyptian stuff, but nothing about Piltdown. Now, I'm going to use some terms here, and I hate to have to define terms, but we're probably better off doing that. A skull means the whole thing. It means the head, the face, and the jaw, the mandible. That's technically, the skull requires all those parts. The cranium is without the mandible. So if you don't have the jaw, you just have the rest of the skull. That's the cranium. Now, the facial bones are pretty delicate, and you often find fossils where the face has gone. It's been smashed into little bits. So all you have is kind of the top of the skull, no mandible, no face. That is the calvarium. And a word that we don't use too much is kalot, where you've lost even more of it. But just be aware of the fact that skull means everything. Cranium means without the mandible. Calvarium means just the head, not even the face. More about that in a bit. To understand the significance of Piltdown, to understand why it was so important, to understand why people were so entranced by it when it was announced, the early part of the 20th century, you need to know a little bit about human evolution and a little bit about timing. So 1856, we have here a photograph of, it's not the first Neanderthal remain found, but it's the first one where it was given a name. This is, in fact, the calvarium that was found in the Neanderthal, which in German means the Neander, named after a person. Tal means valley. Now, if you're saying, Fader, you forgot the H in Neanderthal. It was never pronounced Neanderthal. German orthography, the way they put their words together, actually changed at the beginning of the 20th century, and they got rid of those H's that are not pronounced. And so today, if you look at a map of Germany, it'll name a river valley and call it a Tal, a T-A-L. So lots of folks still stick with the H because that's what it was named back in the 1860s, and lots of folks remove the H because that's the way it's spelled today. But in any event, the important part here is this is a huge ridge of bone above the eyes, a forehead that slopes way back, a really flat back of the skull. Lots of folks saw this and said, this is a very primitive ancestor, or at least relative, of human beings when it was found in 1856. Now, the reconstructions based on that and a few other, that was in Germany, they were found in France, they were found in Italy, they were found in Spain, all having this same configuration. Big ridge of bones right in front, really flat, and more of the skeletons were found. At least one of them, unfortunately, was turns out, it was an older man who actually had arthritis in the spine. So he walked around like this. People grabbed that and said, yeah, that's very ape-like. So they interpreted the bones as being very ape-like. And this reconstruction you see here of kind of a club-toting Neanderthal is very typical for the time. That's 1909. This is from America. This is from the Field Museum of Chicago, of reconstructions of Neanderthal. And they look, the head is usually thrust forward. Sometimes when they're presented with their mouths open. I'm sorry, folks. Nobody looks intelligent leaning over like this. You just look kind of goofy. And that was emphasized, again, to distinguish those guys, those Neanderthals, from us, modern humans. People were much happier with fossils later on found in France, Cro-Magnon, because they look like modern human beings. They have a big forehead. They don't have a thrust-out jaw. They are clearly entirely upright. Even into the 1950s, and the year 1953 is actually important, as we'll see later on. There's this movie called Neanderthal Man. And it's just, if you're into really bad movies, like so bad it's funny, they didn't have a really big budget. It's just kind of, the story is bizarre. There's this scientist guy who shoots himself up with like a serum he's invented to bring out the beast in him because he feels that modern humans are too soft. They're too passive. And he wants to bring back the ferocity of Neanderthal Man. The poster, by the way, is salacious and ridiculous. None of that happens in the movie, but they're selling the movie. He held them all in the grip of deadly terror. Nothing could keep him from this woman he claimed as his own. That's really not what the movie's about. But it's a very funny movie, and yeah, you can probably find it on one of the streaming services. But again, it was a reflection of right straight through the 1950s and even 1960s, how the general assumption was that the Neanderthals were brutish and primitive. This is my own photograph at a roadside museum in North Carolina. And what does that look like? Plaster of Paris? And he's just caveman. Usually when people talk about caveman, they're talking about Neanderthals. And I bring that up because you probably are familiar with the Geico caveman. Geico cavemen absolutely and for sure are Neanderthals. And those commercials are coming back. They're doing more Geico caveman commercials. And showing, so easy, that Geico is so easy, even a caveman could do it. And the cavemen, of course, get very upset about this. Rightfully so, because Neanderthals turned out to be pretty intelligent relative ancestor of modern human beings. They were not cavemen. They were not really primitive brutes. Some of them practiced art. They had they made glue to stick their stone spears onto their wooden shafts. They were very intelligent. And this is the American Museum of Natural History. This is in one of their dioramas. It's a more modern reconstruction of a Neanderthal. Still pretty hairy, and we don't really know that's true, but maybe. But he walks upright. There are people who will tell you, and this is largely true, that if you were, I don't know, sitting on a bus somewhere, and a Neanderthal dressed up in a suit and tie came in and sat down next to you, you would notice that he was kind of a bulky guy, but you wouldn't run screaming from the bus like he's a monster. It looks different, looks in the kind of the far distant range of modern human variation, but nothing to really get excited about. These are a series of reconstructions of Neanderthals. The one on the left is a child who looks like he's a cute little kid. So the top row are all the modern Neanderthal reconstructions. The bottom row on the left, that's the Geico caveman. I don't know if y'all recognize the bottom, the guy in the middle. That is not a Neanderthal, although he kind of portrayed one. He's George the Animal Steel, professional wrestler. The dude actually was like a high school math teacher in, I think it was New Jersey. And his friends encouraged him to go to one of these wrestling displays where if you could stay in the ring with a guy for 3 minutes, you'd get $50. And he stayed in the ring, and the promoters approached him and said, yeah, we really like your look. You look like a caveman. And they made him an offer he couldn't refuse. And he became a very popular professional wrestler. But again, the look of the open mouth, the leaning over, all pure Neanderthal. And the Neanderthal on the right, oh no, that's Jack Black. Well, never mind. But he sort of looks like a Neanderthal there. Genetically, if you are a European, we now know you probably carry between 1% and 3% of your genome is from Neanderthals because of interbreeding. So, yeah, we're Neanderthals. Now, this is a very, very general image of the difference between a Neanderthal on the left and a modern human being on the right. So they tend to be squat. They tend to be broad. They tend to have areas of muscle attachment that are off the charts. They were very strong. Now, the biggest difference really, though, is in their brain. The configuration of their brain, not quite as much up front as we have. The forehead isn't broad, isn't tall. They're human-like for sure. We can even call them humans. They're just a different kind of human being. So now understand, in the background of all that's going on before Piltdown and after, but now let's focus on before, if you're accepting of human evolution, which not everybody was, you're believing that somehow or another this brutish, primitive ancestor maybe branched off, maybe became extinct, maybe devolved, because they're not us, and that we, modern humans, branched off in another direction. But Cro-Magnon's not going to be found until the 1920s, so the discovery of, the first modern human has yet to be made. So people are confused. There are controversies about what the Neanderthals are, who they are, how they fit into human evolution. So there's a lot of buzz about that. People rejected Neanderthals as being our direct ancestor, and there are a couple of reasons why. The first reason was, well, they're not found in Africa. Why did people expect modern humans to be found in Africa? And actually now, we're going to do a little bit of a tangent. It depends on Charles Darwin. You've all heard of Charles Darwin. 1859, that's 3 years after the discovery and announcement of the earliest Neanderthal, although, again, samples had been found previously but hadn't been named. So 3 years later, Darwin's book, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, is published. Now notice, the title was not The Origin of the Species. People sometimes think that and think that he meant that he was talking about human beings. The origin of species is not about human beings. Darwin kind of avoids talking about humans. It's about animals. He only hints at the end, and I'll give you that quote, that, yeah, maybe this is going to be an important way to understand human beings. In 1857, so before that's published, he writes Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace is another guy working on evolution. Actually comes up with some of the same ideas as Darwin. Darwin just had a better press agent, and so he gets a lot of the credit that Russell actually deserves to share. But he writes, what Russell, Darwin does, "You ask whether I shall discuss man. I think I shall avoid the whole subject, as so surrounded with prejudices, though I fully admit that it is the highest and most interesting problem for the naturalist." There's Darwin saying, Darwin had a lot of emotional issues, which led to physical issues. I think that if you were to diagnose him, I hate when people diagnose historical characters, but I'll do that. The guy was racked by anxiety. And here's a guy saying very controversial things and getting a lot of garbage thrown at him because of these controversial things. And he didn't like going out in public and talking about his book. He didn't like going out in public and talking about his theories because he was too anxious. He actually had gastrointestinal problems, serious ones, because of his anxiety. So other people went out there and sold his book, and other people went out there and commented on an evolution. So in Origin of Species 1859, he's not talking much about human beings. Tortoises, finches, it's all about animals. He does say towards the very end, much light will be thrown on the origins of man and his history. But that's all he's going to go. That's as far as he's willing to go, because he doesn't want people to be hypercritical. He doesn't want especially religious folks to come down on him as being some kind of a heretic or as some kind of an evil atheist who is eliminating the idea of God. Darwin talks about man, humans, in 1871 in his another book, The Descent of Man. But here's what he says, and here's why it's relevant to what we're talking about. In each great region of the world, the living mammals are closely related to the extinct species of the same region. It is therefore probable that Africa was formerly inhabited by extinct apes, closely allied to the gorilla and chimpanzee. Okay, so because there are gorillas and chimpanzees in Africa, there must be fossil examples, ancient examples of animals like that. And as these two species are now man's nearest allies, it is somewhat more probable, it's kind of hedging his bets here, somewhat more probable that our early progenitors lived on the African continent than elsewhere. So people are reading that and saying, the Neanderthals can't be our ancestors because they're in Europe. They're not in Africa. And Darwin and other naturalists have suggested that you got to look to Africa for our earliest human ancestors. So nobody's exactly sure where to put the Neanderthals. Clearly they're related to human beings, but they're not here anymore. You don't see people exactly like them anymore. So they're related, but in what way, we're not exactly sure. The second reason why the Neanderthal was rejected, and this is key for the motive of the Piltdown fossil fraud and the reason it was accepted by so many scientists. And this is a fancy thing, fancy label, the brain-centered paradigm. All this is saying, you know what? We think the brain must have been the thing that evolved first. The reasoning being this. When you look at a human being and look at a chimp and look at a gorilla, what's the thing that most clearly distinguishes us from them? Well, okay, we have opposable thumbs, so we can do this. We can write. We have this fine precision grip. And they don't so much because their thumbs are further down on their wrist. Okay, that's a difference. They have opposable big toes, though, so their feet look more like our hands. So their toes, they can grab things. And if you've ever tried to, been lazy and you're barefoot and you tried to pick up a pencil, you just drop with your toes. You know how inefficient that is for most human beings. So that's a difference. They're hairier than most people, yeah. None of those differences seemed absolutely vital or crucial. The two that did, well, one, we can walk on 2 feet, and they're on 4 feet. Okay, that's pretty important. But the thing that we are most proud of, the thing that we are most vain about, is our big brain and our human intelligence. Chimpanzees, the brain of an adult chimpanzee is 1/4 about the size of yours. Gorilla a little bit larger than that. So our brains are hugely inflated. So here's the reasoning. Follow the reasoning. If in our brain, that's the way we are most changed from an ape ancestor, in our brains, if that's the way we're the most evolved, and since evolution takes place over a long time, that must be the thing that has been evolving the longest. Okay, that makes sense. And therefore, it's the thing that evolved first. So looking at Neanderthals, their brains are big, but they're very differently configured. And so the idea here was that Neanderthals are, they're not that old. They're like 80,000, 100,000 years old. It just didn't seem like our ancestor would be a Neanderthal. The brain-centered paradigm just didn't work for that. And so that was one reason why people looked at Neanderthals and said, no, they're just this complete offshoot. They can't be. There must be in our direct line, there must be an ancestor with a really big brain, but the rest of the body is probably not yet, hasn't caught up yet. That's the brain-centered paradigm. Grafton Elliott Smith, who is involved with Piltdown in the sense that he was a supporter of it, he says this in 1927. Here's the deal. He believed this before the discovery of Piltdown. So when Piltdown was discovered, Grafton Elliott Smith, G.E. Smith said, yes, that's what I'm talking about. Because here's what he says after the fact. The brain, this is talking about human evolution, the brain attained what may be termed the human rank when the jaws and face, and no doubt the body also, still retained much of the uncouthness of man's simian ancestors. So the brain is human-like, the rest of the body is more like an ape. In other words, and this is the key here, man at first, so far as his general appearance and build are concerned, was merely an ape with an overgrown brain. Neanderthal didn't fit that. It was too young. The importance of the Piltdown skull, now he's referring, this is 27, so he's referring to the Piltdown skull. The importance of the Piltdown skull lies in the fact that it affords tangible confirmation of these inferences. Right there, Grafton Elliott Smith is telling you why scientists who expected a human ancestor not to look like Neanderthal late in the process, but to look more like a chimpanzee, but with a very much inflated brain size. That's what our ancestors should look like, an ape with an overgrown brain. Piltdown was exactly that. Piltdown fulfilled that expectation. And when I talk about the reasons an archaeological hoax works, one of the reasons is it's what people want to hear and want to believe. Whoever pulled off Piltdown had done their marketing research. That leads us to this fellow, who I have also shown you in the lecture about the Cardiff Giant, when talking about an archaeological hoaxer who was too lucky for his own good. So here's the Wizard of Sussex, Charles Dawson. Dawson was by trade a lawyer. I don't know that he made a lot of money as a lawyer, but he also was an amateur historian, geologist, archaeologist, and paleontologist. And he traipsed around the British countryside, when I guess he wasn't in court, collecting specimens. And he was well known as an amateur who had a knack. He was a wizard at finding things. All right, being a wizard breeds suspicion, breeds resentment. But in his case, he kind of got away with it for a very long time. So anyway, Charles Dawson also, coincidence? No, I don't think so, was kind of the manager of a farm in Sussex, Barkham Mills Manor. So he's the guy who's writing checks. He's the guy who's telling workers on the farm in the manor what to do. And that Barkham Mills Manor in a place called Piltdown is where the story really begins. This is a little timeline here. In 1908, cranial fragments are found by workers in a gravel pit at Barkham Mills Manor. They just kind of put them aside. In 1911, they find 4 more, and they say, that Charles Dawson, he might probably appreciate these. So they show them in 1911 to Charles Dawson, who gets very excited because they look like they're four fragments of a cranium, and they look very human in their configuration. They're really thick, though, and they appear to be very old because they're very darkly stained. Bone goes in the ground white. This is like a very deep rust red or even black. So he figures that's been in the ground for a long time. He's got some experience doing this, so he's excited. Fossils of human ancestral forms were being found by the early 20th century in various places in the world. Germany had its Neanderthals. French had Cro-Magnon, eventually had Cro-Magnon. Java had its own human ancestral form, Java man. Again, later on, China has its own Peking man. But at least by the time the early 2 decades of the 20th century, there are fossil remains in Java, there are fossil remains of humans in Italy, in Germany, in France, in Portugal, in Spain, but not in England. England did not have any human fossils related to human evolution. And at this point, although people were like, kind of ambivalent about evolution, it almost became a competition. Who was the first human being? Was he a German? Was he a Frenchman? Was he a Spaniard? Well, it couldn't be English because there were no human fossils there. In fact, a French paleontologist describing English paleontology said it's mere pebble collecting. Because all they're collecting are stones, they don't have the bones. So Dawson, aware of this, is super psyched. He's stoked that this looks like a very ancient part of a human cranium. In 1912, Dawson sends a note to Arthur Smith Woodward. Arthur Smith Woodward is the primary guy at the Natural History Museum, which was then a part of the British Museum, in London, the primary scientist who pushed the authenticity of Piltdown. Now, Arthur Smith Woodward was the curator or keeper of geology. Big deal, a big role. His expertise, though, was not in human evolution. It was in ichthyology. He was an expert in fossil fishes. That may or may not have played a role. I mean, if you want to be famous in science, if you want to have your name an exalted one in the pantheon of great scientists, being an expert on fossil fishes might not get you there, but being the guy who found the oldest human fossil, being the guy who wrote about and studied and researched the oldest example in the evolution of modern human beings, that certainly would carry a lot more weight. More about that later on. So anyway, so Dawson contacts Arthur Smith Woodward, who, remember, there's no cell phones. You can't text somebody. So communication is going to be slow. Woodward either doesn't respond or can't get down there. So in May of 1912, just a few months later, Dawson brings the bones to Woodward at the museum. Saying, hey, look, I want him to see these things. I want some confirmation that what I've got here is what I think I've got, which is a very significant and important human ancestor. Now, I'd like to have been the fly on the wall when Woodward sees these bones, because he must have flipped out. Because, oh my God, these have to be ancient. They're stained so dark. They're very, very thick, which is a sign of primitive crania in the human line tend to be thicker. And although there are fragments, there are 4 or 5 fragments, when we put it together, it looks like the curvature of a modern human cranium. So therefore, the summer comes around, it's June of 1912. Woodward, Dawson, and a Jesuit minister, whose name was Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard de Chardin became a very famous, he was young at the time, I think he was newly ordained, but he was always very interested in evolution. He was a believer in evolution as a Jesuit minister, believing that God worked through evolution. So science could discern the process by which God had, over a long period of time, had created human beings. So he was interested, he joined in, and they spent that summer excavating in the pit where the workers had found the pieces of cranium. They found, and this is the key, they found half of a mandible. Now, while the cranial fragments, wow, they look really human, the mandible did not. The mandible was the opposite. The mandible immediately was identified as very ape-like, maybe a chimp. So now these scientists were confronted with a conundrum, right? A puzzle. Is it possible that in exactly the same pit, in exactly the same soil layers, we have, for the first time, found a human ancestor and an ape together, or does the mandible actually belong to the cranium? So do we have what Grafton Elliott Smith later would call an ape with an overgrown brain, an ape, a brain, the brain of a human, of a modern human, but even the jaw, the face of an ape? There was one way they could have determined this exactly. But as luck would have it, let's put luck in quotation marks. The area of attachment between, this is the ascending ramus of your mandible. And there's an area of attachment which enables you to move your jaw up and down, right? It attaches, it articulates with the base of your skull, the base of your cranium. Now, the deal here is an ape ramus does not articulate with the base of a human cranium. You can tell that. But guess what part of the mandible was broken off? Missing. Yep, the point of articulation. So they couldn't tell for sure that the mandible really belonged to the cranium, but what are the odds we'd find an ape and a human in the same pit? So they came to the conclusion that they belonged to the same creature. So Piltdown Man looks like it confirms, in some small way at least, the brain-centered paradigm. Now, December 5 of 1912, the first official announcement is made of the discovery of Piltdown. This is in Nature magazine. Nature, I think began publication in like 1863. It's still published. It's a weekly science journal that comes out in the UK. I subscribe to Nature. It is the equivalent in the US. The equivalent is Science magazine. Again, a weekly that summarizes pretty quickly new discoveries in science. So it reads, it's just a little brief announcement. December 5, 1912. Remains of a human skull and mandible considered to belong to the early Pleistocene, the Ice Age, have been discovered by Mr. Charles Dawson in a gravel deposit in the basin of the River Ouse, north of Lewes, Sussex. This is in southern England. Much interest has been aroused in this specimen, owing to the exactitude with which its geological age is said to have been fixed. They are already talking about this being 500,000 years old, which blows Neanderthals out of the water. It's 5 times older, at least, than the Neanderthals. So Neanderthal can't be an ancestor if we've got a large-brained ancestor that dates back to 500,000 years ago. Then, a couple of weeks later, again in Nature, December 19, 1912, the fossil human skull and mandible, to be described by Mr. Charles Dawson and Dr. Arthur Smith Woodward at the Geological Society as we go to press, is the most important discovery of its kind hitherto made in England. The specimen was found in circumstances which seem to leave no doubt of its geological age, and the characters it shows are themselves sufficient to denote its extreme antiquity. So, the Geological Society is holding a conference. Dawson and Woodward have been invited to come to the conference. And this is this perfect kind of, is it the Victorian era? It's actually, I think at this point, is it the Edwardian era? It's just, in my mind, I see all these very nicely dressed gentlemen, mostly men, who are coming to this conference and they're smoking cigars and smoking pipes. And they're skeptical and they're not sure what they're going to hear. And here, Woodward, who's a very well-known scientist and well-respected, and Dawson, who is known, but he's an amateur, and they're literally up on that stage with the specimens and explaining them and explaining what they saw, why they think this is a human ancestor. And people got excited and didn't look as closely as they might have at the specimens. Because had they done so, they would have seen some really kind of funky stuff going on that seemed to indicate that this whole thing had been fabricated. But for the time being, Piltdown is embraced, especially by scientists in England who now can look at the Neanderthals in Germany and France, who can look at Java in Indonesia and say, those are offshoots, those are not in the main line of evolution, those are losers, we've got the best human ancestor. And that really was going on. New York Times, December 19th, 1912, based on Nature. And this is really, the bottom part of this is super important. Paleolithic skull is a missing link. So there's the headline. Below that, human remains found in England similar in some details to bones of chimpanzee. Far older than cavemen. Neanderthals. Neanderthal can't be our ancestor if these guys are, because these guys are much older. Bones, probably those of a direct ancestor of modern man, while the cavemen died out. You can't say it much more clearly than that. It's, hey, Neanderthal, go away. You are an offshoot. You guys are not the human ancestor. Piltdown is. And that, along with making England very happy, it also meant that a preferred paradigm, a preferred view of evolution was being exalted now with actual evidence. This is a wonderful photograph at Piltdown of 4 gentlemen and a goose excavating the site. And here you can see the seated gentleman is Charles Dawson. The guy in the background standing with the overalls, his name is Venus Hargreaves. He was a worker at the estate. So he did all, they wanted some digging, these, nice gentlemen. Venus, would you dig a hole over there? There's Arthur Smith Woodward, the paleontologist. The guy on the left is a college student, Robert Kenward Jr. I'm not sure how he got to see the pit and get in the photograph. And Chipper the goose has attained a level of immortality that few of us will, that we all aspire to, but few of us will actually attain, because we know his name and he was at the site. I guess he was the mascot of the dig. Here's another photograph, again taken, this is 1912, 1913, of Venus Hargreaves there doing the hard work, and Arthur Smith Woodward and Charles Dawson sifting through the soil. They found additional pieces of cranium. They found the bones of extinct animals. They found stone artifacts. So it was looking more and more like, no, this is legit. We've got a site here. We have artifacts. We have animals that may have been hunted. And these are extinct animals. These are animals that we know have been around a long time, proving, lending support to the notion that Piltdown was very old indeed and probably at the root of human evolution. These 3 images in profile show Neanderthal on the left, modern human on the right, and Piltdown in the middle. Now, it's often said that if you look in cross-section at a Neanderthal cranium, it looks like an American football. It's really narrow in the front, narrow in the back, and kind of broad in the middle. If you look at a modern human skull in cross-section, it's more like a soccer ball. It's round. Well, when you look at Piltdown, he's not like a Neanderthal. He's got a big forehead, doesn't have the big brow ridges, and is more rounded. It looks more like a modern human, which is exactly what it's supposed to look like because it's the human ancestor with the big brain. Of course, artists taking their artistic license made all kinds of images of Piltdown, emphasizing the ape-like characteristics of its face and jaw. But the skull, the cranium, is more rounded. This is a really lovely image, I think, that shows the very human nature of the face and cranium of this version of Piltdown. And there's, he's carrying a spear and hunting animals. So this is supposed to be, this is what England looked like 500,000 years ago. This is what Piltdown would have looked like. Paleoanthropologists, anthropologists, archaeologists began putting together phylogenetic trees. These are evolutionary trees showing human beings. This is one from that period where if you look at towards the bottom and you see that black half circle, that is Eoanthropus, dawn man. Actually called Eoanthropus dawsoni. Charles Dawson got the guy named after him. I mean, what's better? You're an amateur archaeologist. You want some recognition. You say you found something really important. They named the damn thing after you. Eoanthropus dawsoni, Dawson's dawn man. And there he is, right at the root. And then if you follow up, it's all these offshoots. Neanderthals, a later offshoot that becomes extinct. Pithecanthropus, which is the Java man, a later offshoot that becomes extinct. A side issue here shows how back when these were being made in the early 20th century, the races were deemed anciently separated. We know now that's not true. We are genetically a very homogeneous species, right? Wherever you are in the world, the human genome looks very similar. But at this period, the desire was to show, oh no, the black Africans, they're way out over here. The Asians, they're way out over here. The Indians, they're way out over here. So that's part of the story, this desire to separate the races. But we all trace back to Eoanthropus. This is another similar chart showing the same thing, where the Piltdown is number 1 on this chart. So again, that's the ultimate human ancestor. Neanderthals are this evolutionary dead end. And then from Eoanthropus, we have all the various races developing. And again, anciently separate. Not true. That's not the way evolution really worked, but it was what people believed. So now we move back to our timeline. In 1913, a human-like canine tooth was discovered. So your canines right there, that was a human-like canine, and it was found, and it seemed to fit into the mandible. Now that was interesting because, again, it was an argument that, well, the mandible can't be an ape mandible because it doesn't have ape-like canines. Chimpanzees, gorillas have enormous canine teeth, where human beings have much smaller ones. Well, the canine that was found with Eoanthropus was in 1913 was a pretty small canine. And so the argument was, that kind of cinches it, that is a human mandible. In 1914, there's this discovery of what even then was called the cricket bat. I don't know if you've ever seen a match of cricket. I watched one in the 1980s. I think it's still ongoing. They go on forever. But they have this bat, right? And when this bone tool was found in the pit at Piltdown, there were people who joked that, oh, look, it looks like a cricket bat. And in fact, that may have been a joke. That may have been the reason that was placed in that pit. Spoiler alert, everything they found in the pit had been planted there. Nothing was legitimate. Artifacts or bones. Now, this is important. So in 1915, Charles Dawson claims to have discovered a second Piltdown locality that had very similar fossil finds. He talks about the cranial fragments being very dark, being very thick. The problem is he doesn't take anybody to that locality. He keeps it a secret. And he stops going in the field, his son gets sick, and then a year later, Dawson dies. He never tells anybody where they were found. The remains are there, so people look at them and go, yeah, this looks a lot like Piltdown. That secondary discovery was very important. You know, you find nothing can be a one-off, right? Science is all about replicability. You have to be able to replicate. Somebody finds a particular kind of fossil over here. Well, we're going to be looking for more examples of that kind of fossil to show that it confirms, yep, that's legit. And especially in the case of a human ancestor that seemed so different from the others that had been discovered, we need confirming evidence. Can't emphasize enough how many paleoanthropologists end up searching for another Piltdown. If you've ever heard of Peking man, those fossils were found later on. One of the things that inspired British scientists to get involved with that was he was looking for confirmation of Piltdown. They found the opposite, though. All the fossils that were being found subsequent to Piltdown, they all negated what Piltdown was implying. They all seemed to support the idea that no, human beings started off as upright apes and the brain developed after that. Between 1916 and 1953, that very thing happens. People are looking for confirmation of Piltdown and not finding it. If you look at textbooks or biology books for a popular audience, they will mention Piltdown, but it's like a footnote or it's kind of an aside, like, well, we find all this other stuff, but Piltdown is different, and we don't know exactly. We're still looking for more confirmation of that. But until we find that, Piltdown's this anomaly. We don't know how to explain it. And that's causing people to question its authenticity. And in 1953, a couple of new approaches to dating, radiocarbon dating and fluorine nitrogen dating, are applied to the mandible and the cranial fragments. And what do they find out? One, completely different ages. They don't belong in the same time period. So they're different animals. When they drilled a hole in the mandible to get a sample that they could date, it smelled like burning bone. It couldn't be old. It had to be really recent. When they looked at it more closely, here's what they found. The cranial fragments absolutely were human, probably dating to the medieval period. So they weren't fresh. They were old, but meaning a few hundred years old. The mandible itself had been doctored. The condyle, where it would have connected to the cranium, had been broken intentionally. And that the teeth, the molars, had been filed with a metal drill, so they all were the same size. And the tooth, the canine, had been jammed into the socket and was being held in there by a material that was much like chewing gum. It almost seems, I know it's easy for me in hindsight, in retrospect, to say, how did scientists not see this? And maybe that's a bit unfair, but an undercurrent here is they didn't want to know that it was fake. At least some of them wanted to know it was totally legit. Who done it? Well, that's a really interesting question. And if this were a detective mystery, I would have to admit to you, we are not 100% absolutely sure who was responsible. And if you're not sure who was responsible, it's hard to know what the motive may have been. But I'm going to give you some suggestions, and I will certainly share with you my opinion. It's not my opinion, it's the opinion of most folks who've looked at the Piltdown, who is responsible. So we got Charles Dawson, Arthur Smith Woodward, Grafton Elliott Smith, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, Sir Arthur Keith, Martin Hinton, Lewis Abbott, and you notice who's at the bottom of that list? Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, 56 short stories, 4 novels. And now to honor Arthur Conan Doyle, I have my own deerstalker cap because I'm a nerd. I have my meerschaum pipe, my magnifying glass, and let's see if we can figure out who's responsible. This is his perp sheet right now. He's got to be involved, right? I mean, he's there for every discovery. He's absolutely vital to the discovery of Piltdown. He's got to be involved. What did he get? What was his motive? Fame. He established himself as a scientist. And you know, he was the center of every one of the discoveries. And he discovered Piltdown 2. By the way, the bones that he found at Piltdown 2 were part of the same cranium from Piltdown 1. People finally look, they go, oh, look, these pieces of the puzzle, they all fit together. So he's got to be involved. I'm going to say guilty, but I will admit, if this were a court of law, I'm not 100% sure that we would convict him. Arthur Smith Woodward, I've actually read an article that claims, oh, he's responsible. His motive here, the idea is that as a curator of geology, as a specialist in ancient fishes, he was never going to be that famous. He was never going to be looked at in the history of British paleontology as a major operator. But if he's involved with the discovery of the human ancestor, the most important human ancestor, that certainly would give him more weight, more gravitas. So that's true, but was that motive sufficient to having him actually carry this out? And the evidence, I think, is very weak. And in fact, his behavior after Dawson died belies that. Arthur Smith Woodward continued working at Piltdown, continued digging after Dawson had died. So if Woodward knows it's a fake because he perpetrated it, why would he spend so much time looking for more evidence? It doesn't really make any sense. Grafton Elliott Smith was a big supporter of Piltdown. It supported his primary thesis about human evolution. But, you know, he was an Australian. He had arrived in England not that much before the Piltdown discovery. The timing just doesn't really work for him to have been there. And there's no evidence at all that he had anything to do with it. I have seen an article by Stephen Jay Gould suggesting that Teilhard de Chardin was involved, the Jesuit minister. And the only evidence that I've ever seen presented was, well, he didn't like talking about Piltdown later in his life. Well, yeah, he was the victim of an archaeological, paleontological fraud. Maybe he was embarrassed, so he didn't want to talk about it much. And in a couple of cases, when he does talk about it, he gets kind of the order of things wrong. And you go, he was older at that point. And how many of us know the exact order in which things happened in our lives? Again, certainly is no evidence that would ever convict him in a court of law. Sir Arthur Keith, who I haven't mentioned previously, again, a big supporter of Piltdown. And again, there's just no direct evidence. Yes, he was a supporter, and apparently he wrote an article under a pseudonym, and there were things he wrote in the article that only the hoaxer would have known, but it's conceivable that he would have heard that stuff from Arthur Smith Woodward and Charles Dawson. So that's a pretty weak argument. Again, purely circumstantial. It's not like Clue. Sir Arthur Keith with the mandible in the playroom. So there's nothing like that going on. Now, Martin Hinton is another really interesting guy in that he was an amateur who provided fossils to the museum. So he would go out there, dig up sites, and he'd come to the museum as an amateur and provide those fossils. And apparently he had a run-in with Woodward, who didn't pay him for something. And in Hinton's possessions, there were other fossils, not related to Piltdown necessarily, but he also had chemicals. These are things that were discovered only in the 1970s. He had chemicals in his possession that were used to stain fossils. So was he the guy who stained the fossils that were then put in the ground to make them look older? There may be a completely innocent explanation in that same chemical, potassium bichromate, was also used by people who discovered fossils to help preserve them. It was used as a preservative. So it's entirely possible that was just an innocent connection, an innocent coincidence. And again, no direct evidence that he was directly involved. Lewis Abbott, another scientist who, again, supporter of the brain-centered paradigm, and he was there at the site occasionally and there in the lab, but again, he's just another name to add to the perp list, but there's no evidence that he was involved. No direct evidence. Which brings me to my favorite, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, I'm kind of a Sherlock Holmes nerd. I've read all the stories multiple times, 56 short stories, 4 novels in the canon. I've watched every Basil Rathbone movie as Sherlock Holmes. The Granada series in the 1990s, I watched every one of those 11,000 times. Love them all. And I have actually published an article about the use of archaeology by Arthur Conan Doyle in the Sherlock Holmes canon. So I love this stuff. But I feel badly for Arthur Conan Doyle. Right now, Arthur Conan Doyle has been accused of murdering a friend of his who gave him the inspiration for Hound of the Baskervilles. He didn't. Arthur Conan Doyle has actually been accused of being Jack the Ripper. Why? I don't know. He had nothing to do with that. And he's been accused of being the inspiration. He's the guy who pulled off the Piltdown hoax. The reason given for that, the motive, is that Arthur Conan Doyle was a firm believer in the paranormal and in spiritualism. Now, which is funny, Arthur Conan Doyle produces the most empirical, scientific mind in all of literature, Sherlock Holmes, who explicitly denies the existence of ghosts, the existence of demons. There's nothing paranormal for Sherlock Holmes, but Arthur Conan Doyle is the opposite. He embraces all of this stuff and was a firm believer in spiritualism, became really active in it after his son died because he wanted to be able to touch with him. Now, here's the deal. A lot of scientists liked the Holmes stories, but they were very negative about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's embrace of the paranormal. Ray Lancaster, another biological anthropologist in England who was in that lab, who did had hands-on experience with Piltdown, was a very loud and explicit and vociferous critic of people who claimed paranormal powers. And so you follow this reasoning, Arthur Conan Doyle was angry at scientists who didn't accept his belief in the paranormal, and he wanted to get back at them. He wanted revenge for that. And so he pulled off this hoax thinking, aha, I will expose them for being the unscientific fools that they actually are. So I will show that they accepted this, that they didn't look carefully, just as they're not really looking carefully at spiritualism and the paranormal. That's a great kind of just so story. But Arthur Conan Doyle never pulled the trigger. He never said, aha, I did it and you're all fools. Well, then what good is doing it if you're not, you can't pull a practical joke on somebody and not then make it a joke. So again, the evidence, purely circumstantial. It is highly unlikely that Arthur Conan Doyle did it. Now, having said all that, Charles Dawson, where did he get a hold of the jaw? Turns out the mandible turns out to be that of an orangutan. Where did he get an orangutan jaw? You can't go to Target and get an orangutan jaw. I mean, that's going to be a tough call. But he does have lots of fossils, and maybe he traded. Did Charles Dawson have the expertise to pull it off so that it looked legit? Maybe, maybe not. There has long been an undercurrent of a belief that Dawson was the useful idiot, that Dawson was really not in on the joke at first anyway, but that he really was excited at finding this stuff, but somebody planted it where they knew he would find out, they knew he would bring it to Woodward, and it would get really famous. It's a far way to go to be able to do that. And then Piltdown 2 becomes it makes it even more problematic. Well, if it was a joke on him, how would he even know to go to the second place to find bones? It certainly sounds like there's a preponderance of evidence that Dawson did it, but I'm not sure that evidence would convict him in a criminal trial. It's not overwhelming, but it's pretty clear that he was certainly involved and probably was the perp. And whether he had any help with it, it's hard to know. This is a wonderful painting of a lot of the people involved with Piltdown. So you've got G.E. Smith and Arthur Smith Woodward, Charles Dawson, A.S. Underwood, Arthur Keith, who I mentioned, W.P. Pycraft. There's Ray Lancaster on the right. And there in the background, in a painting overlooking these guys, is Charles Darwin. It's a painting of Charles Darwin. And there's Eoanthropus dawsoni is on the table being measured by Sir Arthur Keith. 2016, people are still transfixed by this. 2016, they actually got a DNA sample from the mandible. Everybody who had looked at it said, yeah, it's chimpanzee, maybe not, probably an orangutan, one of the lesser apes from Indonesia. And DNA analysis in 2016 cinched it. Yep, it was an orangutan. So somebody went to a lot of trouble to pull off this hoax, and if we knew exactly who did it, we would have a better idea of the motive. But what's important, two things that are important here. Number one, we know why it was successful. Scientists suspended their skepticism a little bit too much, many scientists, and embraced a fossil that now in hindsight, yeah, my goodness, the marks of the file on the teeth, the break of the area where we could have seen if the mandible went together with the cranium. So that's important. But even more important, you will sometimes hear people who are against evolution saying, see, scientists can be fooled. Yes, that's true. But science is self-corrective. The point here is that, yeah, there was a big mistake made in accepting a fraud, but science never rests. It keeps probing and tweaking and revising, and because people just had that suspicion, eventually the truth came out. It can take decades in science, it can. But in the greater scheme of things, science comes out on top, and it did in this case. And I will leave you with a comic from Punch, which is a humor magazine in England. This is 1953, and it's an image of a hairy ape man, Piltdown man, sitting in a dentist chair. The dentist is looking over him and saying, "This may hurt, but I'm afraid I'll have to remove the whole jaw." Ain't nothing like science humor to end a PowerPoint. Thank you very much for listening. Hope to see you again here in this lecture series.